All right, looks like we're on time. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Parrot Analytics Live. My name is Samuel, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Parrot Analytics. To get started, I would like to extend a special welcome to all of our Demand 360 Enterprise customers. And as always, thank you all for making the time to be here with us today, especially those that are connecting from lesser convenient time zones, shall we say, around the globe. We appreciate it. As we wait for the room to fill, please feel free to write in the chat the city and country from where you're connecting from. It's always interesting to see where everybody is from. And remember, by default, chat is set to hosts and panelists. Make sure you set this to everyone before you send your message. Our session today is titled Beyond the Game, Decoding Success in Video Game Adaptations, presented by Lisa Peck, one of our Partner Insights managers. And as a gamer myself, I can't wait to get into today's webinar. Hello, Mexico, Spain, San Fran, Brazil. Welcome, welcome. Of course, New York. Just a couple of admin things before we get started. We've received all of the questions that you have already submitted. Thank you. We will address those at the end of the webinar if we can, that is time permitting. I'll moderate our session today. Please submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar in the chat. Select everyone when you submit your question, as sometimes we get the same question twice. Hello, Canada. Welcome all. Right, once we're done with the presentation, we'll answer as many of those questions that you submit throughout at the end of the session as well. Again, time permitting. And now I would like to hand over to you, Lisa. Take it away.
Thanks, Samuel, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. My name is Lisa, and to echo Samuel, we are going to do a deep dive on video game adaptations to really understand what their current demand is in this age of growing competition and how to discover the next best IP, which is growing and increasingly more important as we have more content released globally. So before we start, I do want to highlight that Parrot is really striving to measure the attention economy. And that's based on the idea that how and where we dedicate our attention is a very finite resource. And that's governed by the economic principles around supply and demand. That said, all content platforms, networks, and brands are inherently competing for consumers' very limited time. So Parrot is able to measure supply and demand of any content, talent, topic, and IP across 2 billion global interactions we track daily. And the engagement is captured across various data sources, which we group into social media, social video, peer-to-peer streaming, and research categories. And all of these interactions that we capture are weighted by the effort it takes for the engagement to happen. So this is then converted into a single demand value, where you will see across our presentation, the demand value is the sole metric that we use to base off any ideas around performance for the video game adaptations that we'll cover in the presentation. Like Samuel mentioned, we did receive a lot of questions from everyone across the world, and those questions we did try to integrate as much as we can into this presentation. And throughout the presentation, we will be covering topics around identifying key characteristics of successful video game adaptations, both TV and movies, and how these adaptations compare against other franchises. So, and also if TV adaptations are more in demand than movie adaptations, and also uncovering the different audiences of these adaptations, whether it be TV or movies, and what their consumption behaviors are now. And towards the end of the presentation, we are going to spotlight some of the recently released TV and movie adaptations like Five Nights at Freddy's, The Last of Us, and Twisted Metal. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be going into some of the video game IP that we pre-selected. So Fortnite, Overwatch, and Valorant. And going into movie adaptations. So movie adaptations, we will be comparing against all US theatrical wide releases. And here, this blue line that you see is focused on all US wide releases, movies released between 2010 to 2023 in the years 2021 to 2023. So measuring the demand in the last 3 years, this is the current trend of all US origin movies. And adding on all IP-based movies, you could see that there is an exponentially higher demand for IP-based movies relative to all movies that you see wide release. And that can be attributed to existing fan bases, existing awareness, and familiarity around the topics for these video game IPs. And you can see that the trend is trending up into 2023 as well. Breaking up the IP-based movies that we saw in the lighter blue line in the previous slide, you could see that the demand for video game IP is the second most in demand, generating about 12 times the average demand. And it only follows literary IP on the left there with 14 times the demand, which includes very successful blockbuster movies from comic book series like DC and Marvel. And at third, you do see toy come up to be the third most in demand IP with the recent releases of Barbie. And moving into the audience demographics. So looking at the demographics of video game adaptations in the US, 74% of the audience are males. And when we look at the generation breakdown, close to 50% of them skew younger, Gen Z, who are 13 to 22 years old. And you do also see a large audience of millennials who are 30 to 39. And when we look at the MPA ratings, so on average demand, looking at all of the adaptations that we saw, G and PG rated movies over-index for video game adaptations versus all US theatrical wide releases. And looking at box office return, which is calculated by what percent of budget the movie makes in opening weekend, you see that family-friendly movies, again, over-index for video game adaptations. So they have, on average, a higher return opening weekend relative to the production budget it takes for the movie to be developed. So across the board, family-friendly movies do generate more demand and generate a high opening weekend return for video game adaptations relative to all wide releases in the US. And when we're looking on the genre level, so to note, Parrot has a flat genre system and that all movies have multiple genre tags. So when we're looking at video game adaptations against theatrical wide releases, we see that comedy, family, fantasy, sci-fi, adventure, and action are over-indexing genres for video game adaptations, and they really are the drivers of demand. So when we look at the genres by demand generated within the release year against the opening weekend return, and this is looking at all movies released in 2017 to 2023, comedy and family movies have a high demand and high return. And this is ideal for theatrical releases because they do attract a lot of moviegoers and they do generate a lot of demand for people to go into theaters to watch these. Similar with animation, where they do have a huge opening weekend return relative to the budget it takes for the movie to be created. When we look at sci-fi, adventure, and fantasy movies, They generate very high demand, but because of the type of movie it is, it's a very expensive production budget. So relative to comedy, family, and animation movies, it is very expensive and it's considered a calculated risk because the demand is still high for these movies. And when we look at dramas, dramas have a high demand, but they don't do as well in theaters. So we suggest either a streaming or a date release. Looking on the title level for the same same movies that we looked at in the previous slide, looking at the release year by opening weekend return, again, family-friendly movies like Mario and Sonic have high demand, and they also have high return opening weekend. And you do see some adult skewing content like Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil that also do well as PG-13 content like Uncharted and Rampage. Now, looking at TV adaptations, we will then be comparing TV adaptations to the movie adaptations that we previously looked at. So bringing back this slide on IP-based movies in the US, layering on TV IP-based shows, you could see that comparing all IP-based TV shows to all TV shows released in the US, they still generate exponentially higher demand. You don't see the same trend where it's up you see for movies, but the demand is still maintained pretty well from 2021 to 2023 at a very high level of around 6 times the average demand of all content in the US. Now looking at genres again, so genre and demand in 2023 for movie adaptations and TV adaptations. Movies over-index on genres like comedy and family, as well as fantasy, sci-fi. And TV adaptations do better with drama, horror, thriller, action. Oops, sorry about that. And these are attributed to the experiences that are associated with people watching movies in theaters versus choosing to watch certain shows at home that lead to some of these genres really outperforming others for these two types of release formats. When we compare the format types on live action or animation for movie adaptations and TV adaptations, we could see that both movie and TV adaptations have a higher demand for live action content. And although very close, and although we saw that family-oriented TV shows and movies do better, there is still a higher demand for live action content than animated. Now going into the age of original IP. So the y-axis that you see here is the demand 7 days pre and post-release. And on the x-axis, you will see the age of original IP. For movies, you see a correlation of older original IPs leading to higher demand at opening weekend and opening week. Whereas for TV shows, there isn't that much of a correlation where even video game IP that are 15 years or younger still show very high demand in opening week. So TV shows aren't as reliant on the original IP to carry the demand for the TV shows. And they really do rely on storylines and what's relevant now for the current audience. So when we look at all original networks and platforms of shows released between 2015 and 2023, we could see that Netflix released the greatest number of video game to TV adaptation. So the majority of these TV shows also are very successful in that they generate 3 times the demand of all average TV shows in the US or greater. And Netflix, that's to say that Netflix really has been activating and attracting this audience base to their platform and doing that very successfully. Now to go into our spotlight of Five Nights at Freddy's and the Twisted Metal against The Last of Us. So our first spotlight is for Five Nights at Freddy's. As you are all aware, it was recently released this past weekend, just in time for Halloween. The movie is a horror mystery thriller movie based on the video game originally released in 2014. One thing to note is the video game is very tightly knit community around streamers and influencers of the game as well. So there is a very big online presence for the video game. So measuring the demand on opening weekend, Five Nights at Freddy's has exceptional demand. So that's to say that it ranks in the top 0.2% of all movies in the US and 56 times the average movie that weekend. So from October 27 to 29. And Freelance, which was a weekend competition for Five Nights at Freddy's, generated about 10 times the demand. So that's still a fifth of what Five Nights at Freddy's generated. And Five Nights at Freddy's also is really over-indexing the horror, mystery, and thriller genres. Now, looking at global performance, so Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't just popular in the US, but it was also very popular across the world, especially in the LATAM markets, where you see that most of the top 10, 6 of the 10 are from these Latin American markets. And across all markets globally, the movie ranked in the top 3% of all movies. Now, tracking movie demand in the last 30 days against the key actors and influencers the movie is associated with, the yellow line is the Five Nights at Freddy's demand. So across from September 30 to October 28th, you do see that there is a slight upward trend, but the trend for talent is a lot more impacted by the release of the movie. So you could see that there really is a correlation with the movie to some of these talent, and maybe the talent plays a larger role in the performance of the movie. And looking at the audience demographics of the movie versus the talent, the highest overlap was with actually Matthew Patrick, who is a YouTuber, and he is one of the most influential YouTubers around the video game. And he was also a cameo on the movie. So showing that there is a high overlap with an influencer compared to some of the actors who acted in the main actors of the movie highlights that influencers and talent generally play a very important role in bringing audiences to the movie. And looking at Five Nights at Freddy's against the genre comps. So looking on the genre level, the movie actually does not track similar to traditional horror movies. Instead, they have a high overlap with video game movie adaptations. So the audiences, so we could treat this as a video game adaptation and not as much of a horror movie audience. Now going into Twisted Metal and The Last of Us. So these two shows were released this year, and Twisted Metal is based on a car combat game, which was first released in 1995. And The Last of Us is an action-adventure game released in 2013. So the storyline is mostly based on the two characters that we'll go into in a second. The audience of Twisted Metal is very male and skews a bit older compared to The Last of Us. And this seems to attract the original players of the video game. And they might treat this as an extension to the game that they used to play or the game that they currently are playing. And for The Last of Us, the successes, they do have a similar audience base to the video game adaptations that we previously saw. So they are pretty successful in reaching that core audience. And they do unlock a larger female audience as well. So tying into how their promotions and storyline were not as reliant on the original IP, but more so themes around the storyline about dystopia and stories around the characters, which plays a huge role in the TV show. And globally, both TV shows were very well received. Both shows were very popular in English-speaking markets, and across the board, The Last of Us did generate a higher level of demand and did travel better to international markets outside of the US. And now looking at the consumption patterns for the Twisted Metal and The Last of Us, we will be looking at consumption affinity. So consumption affinity is identifying what people are also watching who watched Twisted Metal or The Last of Us. And from this, we did identify that viewers have a very different taste in content of what they watch between the two shows. So for Twisted Metal viewers, they watched other shows that revolve around themes and stories around that are similar to video game IP, so sci-fi, action, and thriller shows, whereas viewers of The Last of Us are watching shows, again, that are in that sci-fi, action, and thriller realm, but they are seeking other content that revolve around drama, Western, and comedy. So you could see that The Last of Us slightly has a different audience where they're not as connected to that video game IP world as Twisted Metal is. Now, looking at key talent against the TV show. So at release, the demand for both shows trend pretty similar to the demand of their main talent. And this is especially so for The Last of Us, where the main characters, Joel and Ellie, which were acted by Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, really carry the storyline of the show, as well as their roles in the video game. And then you have Twisted Metal, which is not heavily as reliant on the characters, both in the video game and in the TV show. So the talent correlation isn't as strong. And also to note that when we do measure talent demand, there are multiple factors that go into that talent demand collection. So it's not just associated with this single TV show. For example, Anthony Mackie might have demand that he aggregated for Captain America and not solely dependent on the Twisted Metal demand. Next, looking into lining up both TV shows at start date. The Last of Us has a stronger level of demand throughout its release, and this is potentially attributed to its weekly episodic release strategy. And you see Twisted Metal, it has an earlier decline in demand after its first 2 weeks of release. Since it is a binge release, so people are going to watch the TV show at its release date, they binge the show, and after that, the interest of the show or the need to talk about the show a lot online might be less of a relevant factor than it is for episodic releases where people watch till the end. And to go briefly into the different release strategies of video game adaptations for TV, the pink line that you see in the middle are binge releases. So for binge releases, you see that huge spike in the first couple of days of release. And after that, the demand does decline back to a plateau. And the purple line you see in the top, this is episodic and periodic releases. So although they don't see that huge peak at its first episode release, you do see that they maintain their demand at a very high level up to the end of the season. So people may watch every episode at its release, or people might wait till the last episode to be released to binge the show at its entirety. And the yellow line in the middle are all shows averaged out. Now, looking at potential adaptations, so we will be comparing Fortnite, Overwatch, and Valorant. So we decided to focus on shooter strategy games that have not yet released content. So Fortnite is about 6 years old, released by Epic Games. Overwatch, released 7 years ago by Blizzard, and they did release a couple of animated shorts, but nothing mainstream at the moment. Valorant is about 3 years old and released by Riot Games. So all three video games on Twitch have a very good follower base. They have good viewer counts at any given time, and they are critically rated very well as well. Again, looking at the audience breakdown for each video game, we could see that the primary audience are male and Gen Z, and Fortnite and Overwatch do attract a bit more millennials than Valorant. But for the most part, it's similar to what we saw with other adaptations, where it is a very male-heavy and Gen Z-heavy audience base. Now, doing a deep dive into Overwatch, we will be looking at a compatibility score. So we measure compatibility on a combination of both reach and affinity to the brand. So on the left here, we see that the consumers of Overwatch have a high affinity and reach to game technology and supplier brands like Walmart, Seagate, and NVIDIA. And when we look at talent, most of the top talent that had high affinity and reach to Overwatch are gaming YouTubers and influencers that talk about Overwatch and also post about Overwatch as well. So they share the same audience. And when we look at actors, we do have some familiar faces with actors in superhero movies, whether it be DC or Marvel. And now looking at movie and TV show content affinity. So all content that have a high demand and affinity to the Overwatch brand, we could see that on the top right corner, these shows and movies that generate very high demand are the most compatible with the Overwatch fans. So these do tend to be some of the more popular franchises from Star Wars, DC, and Marvel universes, and also are very popular anime TV shows and movies. And on the right, we have the top TV shows and movies by compatibility score. So based on this, you could see that, again, they are animated, some of the tentpole titles, and DC or Marvel-based IP content. So top scripted TV shows are One Piece, Stranger Things, and Rick and Morty, and top movies are Spider-Man, My Hero Academia, and Five Nights at Freddy's. So with that does bring us to the end. And from this, I hope that everyone could take away that video games do prove to be a very competitive IP for adaptation into content, whether it be TV shows or movies. And really the key is to identify who your target audience would be and to strategize which method of release, what budget or return that you guys are expecting to receive, and how to activate the audiences, both new fans as well as existing players and fans of the original video game IP. So that does wrap up my presentation. So I will hand it over back to Samuel.
Thank you. Excuse me. Yeah, so there weren't too many questions submitted. There was one rather large questions submitted, and there is conversation going on in the chat right now because I handed it back to the room because the question was so large. I think we'll probably require the combined brain power of all of us on today's webinar to try and solve for it. But a fascinating question submitted. Thank you so much, Carlos. And I know, Lisa, that you had already built in some of the questions that were raised up front ahead of the webinar into your presentation today. So um, that actually means we haven't got anything else for you today. So um, needless to say that you did pack a lot in there, Lisa. I hope all of you were well caffeinated for today's session. Please do reach out to us with any further questions you may have relating to today's presentation. The easiest way you can do that is to reply to the email that we will send out in the next 24 hours. And in there, we will also put the presentation itself and the session recording. And thank you again for being with us here today. We will see you at the next Parrot Analytics Live. I've also just put that special coupon link in the chat if you want to sign up to Demand 360 Lite. Put a screen in front of you. You can do that. Make sure you click on that link, sign up. But hey, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next Parrot Analytics Live. Have a great day.